I don't think people understand how crazy the brain is, and transcortical motor aphasia is a good example of that. It all began when a doctor, fascinated by the brain, encountered a patient who had suffered a stroke. The patient barely spoke spontaneously but was able to repeat sentences very well. This marked the beginning of the discovery of what is now known as transcortical motor aphasia. There are many types of aphasia. Aphasia means that you have a language disorder that could make it hard for you to read, listen, write, and say what you mean to say due to a cerebral lesion. The most common cause is stroke, although it could also be due to traumatic brain injury, brain tumors, among other causes. There are many types of aphasia, which vary greatly in their symptoms, depending on the location of the injury. In this case, if the cause is a stroke, it is often due to an occlusion of the anterior cerebral artery, which affects the anterior watershed area of the left frontal lobe, extending to the prefrontal regions. It has indeed been associated with lesions in Brodmann's areas 6, 8, 9, 10, and 46, is classified as a non-fluent aphasia, which means that the output of spontaneous speech is markedly diminished. For this same reason, and because it shares many other characteristics, it is often confused with Broca's aphasia. If you want to learn more about Broca's aphasia, click here. Don't worry if you confuse them, we're going to discuss how they are similar and how they differ. First, their similarities. In this aphasia, just like in Broca's, it is common to find agrammatism, a deficit in formulating and processing syntax. Concerning language production, whether written or spoken, people with Broca's aphasia tend to produce short and simple phrases and avoid complex grammatical constructions, which is called telegraphic speech. This term originates from the era when people used telegraphs, where they had to pay for every word and therefore used only essential words to convey their message. They often omit function words such as prepositions, pronouns, determiners, conjunctions, and auxiliary verbs. The words they speak or write tend to be content words, primarily nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. For example, instead of saying the glass is on the table, they might say glass table. Although most of their comprehension remains intact, it is indeed impaired, although less severely than in other forms of aphasia. Comprehension is particularly impaired for more complex grammatical structures. An example of this is reversible passives, which could be harder to understand. If I say, Bob was kissed by Mary, a person with this aphasia is going to have trouble understanding because they don't know who did the kissing and who got kissed. This is because it would make logical sense for either subject to do the kissing. In contrast, a passive sentence such as, the ball was kicked by Ben, is not reversible. A ball cannot kick a person and would be relatively easy for a person with this aphasia to understand. They also have anomia, which means they have difficulty evoking the words they want to express. This is a problem in all aphasias. This difficulty is found mainly in their spontaneous speech, often expressed through phonemic paraphasias. For example, instead of saying vegetable, they might say vegetable. Less frequently, they exhibit semantic paraphasias. For instance, instead of saying cutters, they might say scissors. Another notable characteristic is the presence of perseveration or perseverative paraphasias. This means that a previous response persists and interferes with the retrieval of a new one. For example, when asked to name body parts, a person might correctly name arm but then repeat the word arm when the clinician points to an ear. Now, the differences. These individuals also exhibit good repetition skills and they can repeat long, complex phrases effortlessly and without error, even in their syntax. This differs significantly from what happens with their spontaneous speech and from Broca's aphasia, which is characterized by poor repetition skills. In fact, their good repetition skills have a dark side and are often expressed as echolalia, which is the involuntary and meaningless repetition of words just spoken by another person. Additionally, they are typically poor conversational partners. They have deficits in initiating and maintaining conversations, which results in reduced speech output. A person may seldom produce utterances and typically remain silent. The utterances they do produce are usually only 1 to 2 words long. However, in more structured and predictable interactions, they tend to respond more fluently and promptly. A structured interaction could be something that can be answered with a factual, one-word response. For example, when asked, "What happened that brought you to the hospital?" the patient would typically appear blocked, struggling with fragments such as I, was, I can't. In contrast, they can respond quickly if asked to state the name of the place where they were born, the name of their occupation, or the names of objects presented visually.